The sun hung low in the sky, painting the plains in streaks of fire. The wind whipped through the dry, cracked earth, kicking up dust that clung to the boots of the gathered crowd. From the edge of town, a murmur rose, a tale that had been whispered under the breath of every man and woman, but never spoken aloud. Rose McAllister. The name itself felt like a curse. A woman who had once danced through life with laughter and grace now stood condemned, her fate sealed by rumors thicker than the dust that covered her shoes. And yet, as she stood beneath the gallows, a quiet defiance shimmered in her eyes, the kind that made even the hardest men hesitate. Now the story of Rose McAllister began in a different time, when the air was full of dreams and possibility. She had once been the very picture of grace in the small town of Laramie Creek, with her pale skin that gleamed like moonlight and her dark, silken hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of shadows. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught the eye of every man in town. It was the fire that burned within her, the spark that refused to be extinguished. She had never been one to obey the rules, to let her life be bound by the expectations of others. She had loved with passion and defied with a stubbornness that made her the subject of gossip. It wasn't until the day the preacher's daughter, Hannah, disappeared from town that the rumors turned ugly. They said Rose had been seen near the creek with the girl, and they said the two had shared secrets beneath the willow trees. The town's collective breath held as the whispers grew louder. Witchcraft, betrayal, sin. And then one morning, Rose was arrested. The old sheriff, a man known for his silence more than his justice, had come to her door, his face tight with the weight of the accusation. No one dared speak her name aloud now. The preacher's wife, who had once called Rose "my dear," now looked at her as if she were a serpent. And as the weeks passed, the quiet town had turned into a courtroom, with whispers filling every corner, until Rose was condemned. Now, here she stood, beneath the gallows. The rope that awaited her swayed gently in the wind, a promise of finality. Yet, as the crowd gathered, hushed and waiting, there was something in the way she stood that made even the harshest men pause. Her eyes were not filled with fear, but with something deeper, something they could not name. She stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly, as if the weight of her wrongs had not broken her spirit. Beneath the layers of dirt and grime, beneath the thin fabric of her dress, there was something that could not be undone. A low murmur ran through the crowd. She's a witch, all right. She deserves this. She ain't right, never was. But then a sound broke through, the soft crack of a boot hitting the dirt. A man stepped forward from the crowd, his face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes unreadable. The rancher, Jonah Hawk. He wasn't supposed to be here. Jonah had been a widower for years, his heart buried beneath the weight of loss. He had never been one for town affairs, nor had he ever taken part in the quiet cruelty that passed for justice. But as the noose was tied around Rose's neck, something shifted in him. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, sympathy, or something more. But when the sheriff looked at him, Jonah nodded, as if agreeing to something that had never been said aloud. The rope tightened around Rose's neck, the knot rough against her skin. Jonah moved forward, slowly as if his legs were made of stone. He could feel the stares on his back, the tension in the air. But none of it mattered. Not now. He was too far gone, too far beyond the point of turning back. Rose's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the wind, reaching Jonah's ears as if she spoke directly to him. "Please," she said, her words thin, as if the weight of everything she had endured had already drained her. Just one more moment. Jonah hesitated. The crowd was silent now, watching him, waiting for him to do what they all thought he would. But Jonah, for the first time in years, felt a stir of something within him, a tenderness that he had buried so deeply beneath his grief. He wasn't sure if it was because of Rose herself, or the way her eyes met his with a quiet understanding. He knew what he had to do. The rope that had once promised an end to Rose's life now felt like a symbol of something far darker, the symbol of all that she had lost, all that had been taken from her. Jonah reached out, his rough hands brushing the coarse rope, and for the first time the crowd held its breath, waiting for him to make his move. What happened next would change everything. Jonah's hand hovered over the rope, his fingers trembling slightly. The crowd, held in a taut silence, watched him intently. He could feel their eyes on him, like the weight of the mountains, heavy, oppressive. They all expected him to walk away, to let the judgment of the town pass through. But there was something in Rose's gaze, something he couldn't ignore. He had been a soldier once, long before the ranch, long before the grief that had turned his heart into a hardened shell. He had fought in battles where men died without dignity, without a whisper of a final stand. But this was different. Here, it wasn't the gunfire that held him captive, but the weight of a woman's silent cry, a plea for mercy that the town had refused to give her. Jonah reached for the rope. The crowd gasped collectively, some murmuring under their breath, others shaking their heads as though Jonah had just committed an unforgivable sin. But there was no turning back now. He grasped the rope, his fingers biting into the rough fibers, and began to loosen the knot. It was a small act, a simple one. But in that moment, it felt as though the very air shifted, as if the wind itself held its breath. Rose's gaze never wavered from him. Her expression was unreadable, but her lips parted ever so slightly. A silent acknowledgement, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. She had known all along, hadn't she, that someone, someday, would see past the rumors, past the lies, that someone would see her for who she truly was. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest as he worked the knot free. The townsfolk were still silent, watching this moment unfold. Some wanted to speak, to shout out their condemnation, but none of them dared move. The rawness of it all seemed to paralyze them. The noose slipped from her neck with a faint rasp of rope against skin. Rose gasped, but it was a sound of relief more than pain. The air between them was thick, heavy with the smell of sweat and dust, and the unmistakable weight of defiance. Rose's feet scraped against the dirt as the rope fell to the ground, its purpose undone. Jonah stood there, frozen for a moment, his hand still extended toward her. What was he doing? He didn't know. But he couldn't bring himself to look away. She had been wronged, more than wronged. Her life had been destroyed by the twisted tongues of people who thought they knew her. And in that moment, Jonah knew that this act, this small, defiant action, was the least he could do. "Don't touch it, please," Rose's voice cracked. Her words hung in the air like smoke, delicate and pleading. She was not asking for his help, but rather for his respect, for his understanding. Jonah's heart clenched. He knew what she was talking about. Beneath her tattered dress, beneath the dirt and sweat, there was something more. A symbol that had been branded into her skin, a mark of shame that she could never erase. Jonah turned his head, his jaw tight as he fought the urge to turn away. The brand on her skin was fresh, ugly, a crude mark of a woman betrayed, the symbol of her condemnation. He could see it now, beneath the fabric, the outline of a symbol no woman should ever bear. A single word, scorched into her skin, witch. It was as though the word itself had come to life, carved into her very flesh, a permanent reminder of all that had been done to her. And though the mark was now a part of her, it did not define her. It was only a symbol of injustice, a mark laid by men too frightened to see the truth. "I promised it wouldn't hurt," Jonah said, his voice rough, like it had been scraped raw by the very wind that whipped through the crowd. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. Without another word, Jonah stepped closer to her. His fingers, calloused and thick, reached for the hem of her dress. The fabric was worn thin from the constant strain of days spent in the harsh sunlight. With a soft tug, he pulled it down just enough to expose the brand. It was small, but the heat of it still radiated from her skin, a raw, red reminder of the past that she could never escape. She winced slightly, but did not flinch away. Her eyes remained locked on his, and for the first time since the moment of her arrest, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them. It wasn't pity, nor sympathy. It was an understanding, a silent recognition of shared pain. "Go ahead," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper over the wind. "If you're brave enough." Jonah's breath hitched in his chest as he knelt before her. His rough leather gloves scratched against her skin as he gently pressed his palm to the raw mark. It wasn't a touch of tenderness. It was something else, a promise, an acknowledgement of the weight she carried, and a small flicker of defiance that had been hidden beneath the surface. Her breath caught as his hand moved slowly over the brand, the roughness of his gloves scraping against her skin, but she didn't pull away. She stood still, as if bracing herself for something far greater than the physical pain she had already endured. And then, as his fingers traced the brand, something unexpected happened. The crowd, once silent, began to stir. Jonah felt the shift in the air, the tension, the uncertainty. But it was not just in him. It was in all of them. The quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. A small crack had formed in the wall of judgment that had held the town captive for so long. The child's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "She ain't a witch. She's just a woman." The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried more weight than any of the hardened voices that had condemned her. It was a crack, a small, imperceptible break in the armor of prejudice that had been built over years. The crowd shifted, uncertain, as if the world had tilted just a little. Jonah looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. He met Rose's gaze once more, her eyes now filled with something that hadn't been there before. Hope. A quiet, fragile thing, but a thing nonetheless. Jonah stood, his hand still resting gently on her skin, his thumb brushing across the mark, as if trying to erase it. His voice, rough and unsteady, broke the stillness. "You're not alone," he said, more to himself than to her. But it was a promise, even if he didn't yet know how he could keep it. As the words hung in the air, Rose closed her eyes, letting the faintest of smiles pull at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It wasn't the smile of a woman who had won. It was the smile of someone who had survived, and who had, for the first time, been seen. The sun had now slipped beneath the horizon, leaving a cool, shadowed silence that stretched across the plains. Jonah stood beside Rose, his hand still resting on her shoulder, though his touch had softened now, no longer firm with purpose, but gentle, as though he were afraid to break something fragile. The last whispers of the crowd slowly faded as the weight of the moment settled over them. For the first time, the townsfolk were quiet, unsure of what to do next. The child's words still hung in the air, like the faintest smoke rising from the ashes of a dying fire. Rose's name, once a curse on every tongue, was now no longer simply the product of rumor. It was a name that had been spoken, acknowledged, defended, even if only by a child too young to understand the full consequences of her declaration. But, as the last of the murmurs died, there was no immediate outcry, no immediate rush to drag Rose back to the gallows. Something had shifted. Jonah didn't know what, but the very air felt different, charged with the kind of uncertainty that only a defiant act could create. Jonah knew what had to be done. It was a gut feeling, the same instinct that had led him through battles, through grief, and through the endless stretches of loneliness after his wife's death. The world, for him, had always been a series of tasks to be completed, burdens to be carried. But here, now, with Rose standing before him, it felt as though he was about to do something far more profound than he ever had before. "You should go," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if the very act of speaking was a weight he had not carried in years. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, their hesitant faces still turned toward them. Rose tilted her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the last dying rays of the sun. "Go where?" Jonah hesitated, his jaw tightening. There was a hesitation in her voice, too, a reluctance that had taken root in her soul. She had been branded, betrayed, left to rot in the small, judgmental town. But it wasn't just the mark on her skin that held her here. It was something deeper. A part of her had become rooted to this place, to these people, even though they had turned on her. Jonah stepped closer, his boots crunching in the dust. "I know you ain't ready to leave, but there's a place beyond this. Somewhere you can breathe without people judging every step you take." Rose's lips parted as though she wanted to argue. But instead, she closed her mouth and exhaled slowly, the words she might have spoken lost in the air between them. "You should go," Jonah repeated, his voice firmer now, carrying an authority that was unexpected. He wasn't a man who liked to command. But here, with Rose standing before him, something in him snapped. Maybe it was the weight of her silent suffering, or the look in her eyes. But whatever it was, it moved him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Rose hesitated, and in that pause, Jonah could hear the thrum of her heart, just as unsure as his own. She wasn't ready to leave everything behind. Not yet. Her feet were still bound to this place by the stories that had been written about her, by the lies that had become the truth. But Jonah could see it, the small, fragile flicker of something new in her eyes, something that had been buried under layers of dirt and shame. "I'll help you," Jonah said softly, his hand brushing against her shoulder again, this time more comforting than before. "I'll help you find that place, but you have to let go of the past first." Rose's eyes flickered with a storm of emotions, anger, grief, something akin to fear. But there was a shift, too, a realization. Slowly, she nodded. The quiet hum of the town seemed to press in on them. No one moved, no one dared break the delicate silence that had descended upon the dusty street. And for a moment, it felt as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Why are you doing this?" Rose finally asked, her voice almost lost in the breeze. Her face was turned towards him now, the faint glow of the moonlight casting sharp shadows along her cheeks. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for answers. She just needed to know why he, of all people, had chosen to help her. Jonah didn't have an answer. He wished he did, but he didn't. What he did know was this. He was tired of the weight of other people's sins. He was tired of walking through life like a ghost, carrying his own grief without ever allowing himself to be truly seen. With Rose, it felt different. She was a woman who had been wronged, a woman whose suffering had been hidden behind the walls of gossip and lies. He couldn't undo her past, but he could help her rebuild something from the ashes. He sighed deeply, pulling his hat off and wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "I don't know. Maybe it's because I can't stand to see someone suffer for something they didn't do. And maybe it's because you ain't as broken as they think you are." For a long moment they stood there together, caught in the stillness that only the desert at night could provide. The sound of the wind was their only companion, whispering secrets that neither of them had the strength to unravel. And then, as though an unspoken understanding had passed between them, Jonah stepped back. He didn't say anything more. There was no need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. Rose, still unsure but determined, took a hesitant step forward. The crowd began to stir, their murmurs returning, but now there was a note of uncertainty in their voices, as if they, too, were unsure of what they had witnessed. The image of Rose, standing free, no longer bound by the rope, no longer tied to the shame of their judgment, had left something in their hearts unsettled. Jonah turned away from the crowd, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Without a word, he led Rose toward his horse, the soft sound of hooves in the dust, the only thing that filled the space between them. Rose followed silently, her hands trembling as she adjusted the hem of her dress. The brand on her skin still throbbed with the heat of the past, but in this moment she was something more. A woman who had been broken but was beginning to piece herself back together, slowly. Jonah helped Rose onto the horse, the saddle creaking under the weight. As he swung up behind her, his heart beat steadily against her back, as though it were trying to tell her that this moment, this small act of defiance, was only the beginning of something far greater. The town of Laramie Creek disappeared behind them, fading into the night like a forgotten memory. And as they rode into the darkness, Jonah and Rose found themselves bound not by the shackles of the past, but by the promise of a future still to be written. The moon hung high above the open plains, its pale light casting long shadows across the ground. The world seemed still, untouched, as though it was holding its breath for the ride that Jonah and Rose had begun. A journey away from the past, away from the suffocating weight of judgment. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Jonah felt something that had long been absent: hope, a quiet kind of hope, buried deep beneath the layers of grief and loss. Rose sat before him on the horse, her back pressed gently against his chest. The rhythmic clip-clop of the hooves in the dust was the only sound between them, and though neither spoke, there was a quiet understanding in the way they shared the space. Jonah's hand rested lightly on her waist, a steady, comforting presence that made her feel less alone in the world. The night was cold, but the heat between them, though unspoken, was palpable. Rose's skin still bore the mark of shame, but Jonah knew that it wasn't the symbol on her skin that defined her. It was the way she held herself now, the way she walked in the world with a quiet grace that had been absent before. She was no longer a woman broken by the weight of rumors. She was something more. She had become the symbol of defiance, of survival. They traveled without words, leaving Laramie Creek behind them like a bad dream that had no place in the dawn. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the quiet, steady pace of the horses' hooves and the long stretches of golden prairie that seemed to roll on forever. There was no hurry. They were both in no rush to reach a destination. They simply rode, each step taking them farther from the place that had once been home and closer to something unknown. Jonah never asked Rose where she wanted to go. It was clear that she didn't know either. All she wanted was to be free, to be untethered from the weight of her past. The brand on her skin, though still there, felt lighter now. It was as if the act of leaving had begun to erode its power. Rose hadn't spoken much of her past since they left Laramie Creek, and Jonah had given her the space to grieve in her own way, without the need for explanations or apologies. There were things that couldn't be undone, but there was still a future ahead of them, a future they could shape together. It wasn't until the third night on the road that they stopped to make camp. The fire crackled softly in the night air, the flames licking the edges of the dry wood as Jonah set up their camp. The stars above were bright and cold, and the vast emptiness of the plains stretched out around them like an endless sea of darkness. Jonah sat down by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows on his weathered face. Rose stood a few paces away, her back to the fire, her silhouette sharp against the sky. She was looking out into the distance, her mind somewhere far away, lost in thoughts Jonah knew she hadn't yet shared. He watched her for a moment, noticing the way the firelight danced on her skin, the way the shadows of the night clung to her like a cloak. It was as if she were a part of the landscape now, as if the world had claimed her in a way it never had before. Finally, Jonah spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You ever been this far from home?" Rose didn't turn around at first. She just stood there, her shoulders tense. The question hung in the air between them for a moment before she finally answered, her voice soft but clear. "No," she said, her words carrying the weight of all the things she hadn't said before. "Never. I've always been stuck there, in Laramie Creek, always known the same people, the same land. But it wasn't home, was it? Not really. Jonah nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. No, it wasn't. There was a long pause before Rose spoke again. This time, her voice was a little stronger, though still tinged with that quiet sadness that she carried. I never had a choice in the matter, she said, turning toward him now, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. It was all chosen for me. The way I lived, the people I had to please, even the brand, it was all forced on me. I never got to choose my life, Jonah. Jonah looked at her then, his gaze steady and unwavering. You do, now. Rose's eyes flickered down to the fire for a moment, as though weighing his words. Then she nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the small bundle of firewood at her feet. She threw another log on the fire, the flames flaring up briefly before settling back into a steady burn. The crackling of the wood was the only sound for a while, the quiet between them, holding a weight that wasn't uncomfortable, but necessary. The past, with all its weight and injustice, had been left behind. But the road ahead was not without its own trials. Jonah knew that. They had not escaped their pasts by simply riding away from it. No, the road they traveled was one that would demand everything from them. Not just the strength of their bodies, but the strength of their spirits. They would have to rebuild. Not just their lives, but their trust in one another. As the night wore on, the fire slowly burned down to embers, and the moon rose higher in the sky. Rose sat across from Jonah, her legs crossed beneath her, her head slightly tilted toward the stars. Jonah stretched out, his eyes on the fire, his thoughts lost in the quiet of the night. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, as he sat next to Rose, there was a sense of peace. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was something more, something earned. The hours passed, and slowly they both drifted into a quiet sleep beneath the stars. The soft crackling of the embers filled the silence, and the wind that swept across the plains carried with it the scent of distant rain. But as they slept, neither knew that the past wasn't finished with them yet. The long shadow of Laramie Creek stretched further than they realized, and the echoes of the town's judgment would follow them, not as a threat, but as a challenge to prove that they could survive, together, in a world that had once condemned them both. The morning sun rose slowly over the plains, casting its light across the open landscape. The wind had picked up during the night, and now it stirred the tall grasses, making them ripple like a sea of green and gold. Jonah woke first, his body stiff from sleeping on the cold ground. His boots were still beside him, and his hat was tipped over on the ground, half buried in the dirt. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only a few smoldering embers. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the familiar ache in his muscles from days of travel. It wasn't the same as the ache from the war or from grief. It was different, more like the kind of tiredness that comes from living on the open land, when the only way forward is the one step at a time. Jonah glanced over at Rose. She was still asleep, her dark hair spilling across the ground in a tangled mess. Her face was peaceful now, free from the torment that had once clouded her eyes. The weight of her past seemed lighter for a moment, as the sun bathed her in its warm glow. But Jonah knew better than to believe the world would leave them in peace for long. The past always has a way of catching up with you. And for Rose, it wasn't over yet. The day started without incident, and Jonah and Rose continued their ride. The sound of the horses' hooves in the dirt, a steady rhythm beneath them. The prairie stretched out before them, unbroken and endless. There were no fences, no towns, just the rolling hills and the open sky above. It was a freedom Jonah had never known before, but the silence between them had begun to feel heavier with each passing hour. Rose had said little that morning. Her face was drawn, and her eyes kept darting to the horizon, as if she were waiting for something or someone to appear. Jonah wasn't sure if it was the weight of the night or something else, but he could feel her distance growing, as though the ghosts of her past had followed them out onto the open plains. He didn't press her. She would speak when she was ready. By midday, the temperature had risen, and the heat of the sun began to press against their skin. Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow as they approached a small stream where they could water the horse. He guided the animal toward the water's edge, and Rose slid off the saddle, her stiff limbs grateful for the break. She stood for a moment, just looking at the stream, her expression unreadable. Jonah untied the canteen from his saddle, taking a long drink, but his eyes never left Rose. Something was bothering her. He could feel it. "Rose," he called softly, his voice carrying across the quiet stream. "You're not saying much today. What's on your mind?" She didn't turn to look at him at first. She stared at the water, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't outrun it, Jonah." Jonah stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth beneath him. "What do you mean?" He could see her profile now, the hard line of her jaw, the way her shoulders tensed, as though she were bracing for an impact. "The past," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's always there, just behind me. Even now, even out here, where nobody knows my name, it follows me. The things they said, the things they did." Jonah remained silent, watching her as she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were filled with a rawness he hadn't seen before, an ache so deep that he could feel it in his own chest. "I thought leaving Laramie Creek would be enough," she continued, her voice shaking. "But it's not. I thought if I just rode far enough, I could forget. But every time I close my eyes, I see the brand. I hear their voices. I feel the rope. I can't escape it, Jonah." Jonah's heart ached for her. He could feel the weight of her words, the depth of her pain. She had been through more than any person should endure. And now, as they stood together beneath the vast sky, she was confronting the truth that had followed her all this time. "You don't have to run anymore," Jonah said, his voice steady and firm. "Not from them, not from what they did to you." Rose looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any trace of doubt. "But I am running, Jonah. I'm still running." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're not running. You're choosing. You're choosing to live. And that's something they can't take from you. Not anymore." The wind picked up again, sending a soft breeze through the long grasses. The sound of the stream flowing was the only thing that seemed to fill the space between them. And for a moment, Rose was still, her eyes lowered to the ground. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. "I don't know how to stop carrying it." Jonah took a step closer, his hand reaching out to her, but he didn't touch her yet. He simply waited. He had learned, through his own grief, that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Sometimes all a person needed was to know that someone was there, that they weren't alone. "You're not alone," Jonah said, his voice quieter now, more intimate. "And you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Rose looked up at him then, her face softening just the smallest bit. The tension that had been so tight in her shoulders seemed to loosen. She didn't say anything at first, but as she looked at him, something shifted. The past, the weight of it, still lingered. But for the first time, Jonah saw a glimmer of something else. A flicker of trust, a spark of hope. "I don't know where to go from here," she said after a moment, "but I don't want to carry this anymore." Jonah nodded, his eyes steady and unflinching. "We'll figure it out together." The breeze carried the scent of the open land, the clean, crisp air that filled their lungs with the promise of freedom. Rose breathed in deeply, letting the wind wash over her, as though it were cleansing her. Slowly she allowed herself to smile, just a little. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It wasn't even a smile of victory. It was something quieter, something earned. She wasn't running anymore. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jonah and Rose mounted the horse once more, side by side. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together. The past, no matter how it had shaped them, could not define them anymore. The only thing that mattered was the road before them, the road that they would walk together, with the promise of a future yet to be written. The wind carried them forward, away from the past, into the unknown, where anything was possible. And in that quiet moment, Jonah knew that they had both earned their survival. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more Wild West tales and adventures.